Shalom and welcome to the first lesson in our series, Amos, Prepare to Meet Your God. Before beginning this lesson, I'd really encourage you to go back and read the first two chapters of the book of Amos. And for cultural and historical background, I'd also encourage you to watch our four-part series of Obadiah and Joel, Lord, Spare Your People. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for notifications when new videos are posted. And while you're over there, check out the other studies that are available. If you'd like to join us for our live study, you can contact me through Facebook Messenger, and I'll send you the link and password for our free Zoom classes held every Thursday from 6:30 to 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Now, below this video is a link to the student pages for this lesson. Now, just to give you a little bit of the historical setting of the book of Amos, we read in chapter 1, the first couple of verses, that Amos actually was a shepherd. He was not brought up as a prophet. He was not brought up even as a Nazarite. He wasn't even brought up as a priest. He was a shepherd from this little town called Tekoa, which was about 12 miles south of Jerusalem and about 6 miles south of Bethlehem. So given that he was in Tekoa, he was actually from the southern kingdom, but he didn't prophesy in the southern kingdom. He didn't even stay in the southern kingdom. God called him to move into the northern kingdom and to prophesy to them. Now, we're also told that he was a prophet during the time of King Uzziah of Judah in the southern kingdom and Jeroboam II of Israel, which was in the northern kingdom. He prophesied approximately from 767 to 755 BC, so just over about a 12-year period. And if you can remember your history, that's only about 33 years before the northern kingdom was captured by the kingdom of Assyria in 722. It also tells us that this prophecy that he was given to the northern kingdom came about 2 years before an earthquake. And this was actually verified in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 5. Now, his name is a very interesting name. The name Amos is Amok in Hebrew, and it means a burden. So either his parents really didn't like him much and named him that he was a burden to them, which would be a terrible thing for a parent to name their child, or maybe it was not really the name he was given with, but because or when he became a prophet, maybe he took on the name Amok because typically prophets start that this is a burden from the Lord. Now, King Jeroboam II of the northern kingdom was, as his name suggests, the second Jeroboam. He was not really related to the first Jeroboam, but Jeroboam I was the very first king of the northern kingdom when the kingdom actually split back after the days of Solomon. So, as did his predecessor, he did evil in the sight of the Lord and followed in the sin of Jeroboam I, in which he caused Israel to sin. Our mantra, if you've been studying with us in our series of the kings and the prophets. He reigned 41 years, and he was a tremendously wicked king of a tremendously wicked nation. But God still actually used him and prospered him to restore Israel's borders. And during the time of Jeroboam II, we read that the people of the northern kingdom were in this great time of great distress. They were really having a hard time. They were going through famines. They were going through plagues. They were being conquered by all these different countries. They were losing huge chunks of their land. But God, during this reign of this evil king in this evil nation, he used King Jeroboam II to restore those borders and to actually make life really, really good for the people of the northern kingdom. As a matter of fact, we read that Jonah prophesied that the borders were going to be restored to the areas, which was exactly what happened when Jeroboam II was king. And part of that land recovery happened to include the land of Damascus. Now, during Jeroboam II, this was the height of Israel's prosperity as a nation. They had never been this prosperous in their entire history. They had a whole lot of rich people who unfortunately took great pleasure in oppressing the very poor people. They built summer homes, they built winter homes, and they really pushed out and really took advantage of the poor people in the northern region. Now, after he'd been reigning about 28 years, Uzziah actually became king of the southern kingdom. Now, he's called Uzziah And in other scripture, he's called Azariah, exact same person. Now, he became king. He was a teenager. He was only 16 years old. And he actually reigned for 52 years. And unlike Jeroboam II, he did right in the sight of the Lord. He was a righteous king. He was a good king. And because of that, Judah was actually also very prosperous. They were more prosperous than they had been in the time of Solomon. But in his later years, Uzziah became very arrogant and very proud against God. He actually decided to take it upon himself to go into the temple and to burn incense. And that is a huge no-no. That right was only given to the priesthood, of which Uzziah was not. And the priests came and they confronted him about it. And where did God strike him with leprosy? Very interesting, on his forehead. So Uzziah was actually sent off into exile, into a different palace away from everyone else. And his son then judged the people of Judah until Uzziah died, and then his son actually became king. So even though the southern kingdom had a king who sought the Lord, as a whole, the people were revolting against God. Because one thing that King Uzziah did, and actually all of the kings did, is they never ever took down the high places. They left these idol-worshiping high places, and they left them there so that the people continued to go and worship these idols. So during the time of Uzziah, a righteous king, the people were still, bloodshed, oppression. I mean, that was just kind of everyday life in the southern kingdom. And justice, for whatever you want to think of justice, I mean, it was for sale. The people were calling good evil. They were calling evil good. They were so busy adding on and buying house to house and field to field. They were literally getting further and further away from God. And you say, well, what does that really matter? They were prosperous. Who wouldn't want to build houses and houses and fields and fields? The problem was, the further you got away from the temple, the easier it was to have the excuse that, that temple is just too far away. God will understand. I'm out here taking care of my business. I'm out here taking care of my house. I'm out here taking care of my field. So really, he would understand if I didn't show up. It's just one Sabbath. It's just, 5 Sabbaths. It's just a festival. It really doesn't matter. And guess where the high places were? Out, away from the temple. So the further that they physically got away from God, the closer they got to these high places and to this idol worship. Scripture tells us in Amos that there was a lack of knowledge of God's word because they were just flat out rejecting the law. It wasn't that they weren't told. It wasn't that they didn't know. It wasn't that there weren't priests there to teach them. It's just that they flat out rejected it. They didn't care. So both kingdoms, northern and southern kingdom, were at the height of their prosperity when Amos comes on the scene in the northern kingdom to prophesy. Now, in the book of Amos, it's really short. It's only 9 chapters long. There's 3 distinct divisions, and it's all centered around 3 key phrases. For tonight, what we're going to look at is chapters 1 and 2. And the key phrase in those chapters are, for 3 transgressions of blank, and it lists a country. And for 4, I will not revoke its punishment. Now, transgression it is a sin. It's a pesha, but it's also a rebellion. And it could mean a rebellion against a person, like a king or a boss. It could mean a rebellion like a nation, rebelling against a nation, like getting ready for war. And it could also mean a rebellion against God. And God says, you know what? Because of their 3 transgressions or their 4 transgressions, I'm not going to revoke its punishment. I'm not going to shuv. I'm not going to turn that away. There will be no relenting, like we saw in our study of Joel. There will be no relenting of this punishment. I'm not going to turn it back. It's coming. In our next lesson is going to cover chapters 3 through 6. You're going to notice another key repeated phrase, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. Our third and last lesson of Amos will unpack chapters 7 through 9, which will have even a third key repeated phrase. So as you study these chapters in the coming couple of weeks, be sure to identify these phrases and note how God is working through them and who or whom these phrases are directed to. Now, given the duality of prophetic scripture, and we've talked about this in our last study, what category do you think Amos actually falls under? Is this a near-time prophecy versus an end-time prophecy, which would be like a partial near-time fulfillment, which will also have an end-time full fulfillment? Or is it what I call a historical reality versus a type, such as we saw in Joel with the locust plague? We really don't see any big historic event. I mean, an earthquake is mentioned, but it's still 2 years away. So Amos doesn't use this earthquake to kind of get their attention and then make a comparison about what's going to happen in the future because of this historical event. So I would have to say that this would actually fall under the category of a near-time partial fulfillment, that we're going to see a full end-time fulfillment. So, got all that? All right, here we go. Chapters 1 and 2. Now, Amos does not ease into his message from God. He doesn't just kind of waltz in and just kind of, make some friends and then just kind of start talking to people. And as he's talking, this prophecy sort of ramps up. That's not how Amos does it. This is how Amos starts, right out of the gate. He says, the Lord roars from Zion, the southern kingdom of Jerusalem. And from Jerusalem he utters his voice, and the shepherds' pasture grounds mourn, and the summit of Mount Carmel dries up. Now, these pasture grounds that are mourning and Mount Carmel, the summit drying up, that sounds a lot to me like a drought is coming. And when a drought comes, there's a famine that's coming to the land. Well, wait a minute now. The northern kingdom is being very prosperous. They have a lot of food. The land is very fertile right now. And so for them to not be able to continue in this lavish lifestyle because they're about to lose their food and their food source and their animals could possibly die because of this drought, that could be a really devastating message. But the message of Amos switches really quick because the focus isn't Mount Zion, it's not Mount Carmel, it's not even Israel. He starts out with 6 nations who are actually going to be judged because of their rebellion, but not because of their rebellion against God, against their rebellion of Israel and Judah. So we're looking at a nation versus nation rebellion. And the very first nation that Amos prophesies against is Damascus, which is the capital of Aram, which is in modern Syria. If you studied with us, Aram is a constant enemy and antagonist of the northern and the southern kingdom. And in modern times, in today, Syria is a constant antagonist to the state of Israel. Now, this war with Israel goes way back to the time of Baasha, who was a very, very early king. Now, God actually uses Aram and the kings of Aram to judge both the northern and the southern kingdoms. But if you look, why is Damascus specifically judged? Why is it being proclaimed against Damascus? Because it says they went against Gilead. Now, Gilead is a part of Israel, part of that northern kingdom. And their judgment is going to be by fire. As a matter of fact, each one of these prophecies against these nations mentions fire. And fire is very symbolic of God's wrath, and it's very symbolic of God's judgment. And specifically, God says he's going to destroy their citadels, their armon. That's like a fortress or a palace. It's typically always part of the palace fortress. So it's a fortified dwelling, a military stronghold. And typically, if an army gets in through the walls If they can tear down the citadel within the walls of the city, your city's pretty much gone. I mean, it's toast. Most of your military is not going to be inside the city to begin with. It's going to be outside fighting, or it's going to be on the walls fighting. But that citadel is what's going to protect the royal family and the heirs to the throne of that kingdom. And so once you break down the citadel, the royal family's gone and the city's pretty much yours to take. And God says, you know what? I'm going to tear down your strongholds with fire. They're just not going to be torn down. They're going to be utterly and completely annihilated and destroyed. Now, the next nation that he says he's going to judge is Gaza, which is in the Philistines, which is part of what we now call Palestine. Now, God gave the land of the Philistines to Israel way back in antiquity. And these two nations have been enemies pretty much since the days of Joshua. Now, in Philistia, the land of the Philistines, there's what we call a pentapolis. And a pentapolis is they just had 5 really big cities, very large cities. And they were Ashdod and Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Now, when you look down in Amos, Gath isn't mentioned as part of Amos's prophecy. Only Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gaza are mentioned. And that's simply because Uzziah actually destroyed Gath in 2 Chronicles 26:6. So by the time Amos is prophesying, it doesn't even exist anymore. So that's why there's no judgment against them or no prophecy against them, because they're just not there. Now, they're specifically being judged because they deported, it says, an entire population, and they gave it to Edom. So this population of Israel, this community in Israel, they captured them, and they actually sent them into slavery, into their enemy, into the land of Edom. Now, this was probably during the reign of Jehoram, when Jehoram was king of the southern kingdom of Judah. And their judgment is a judgment of fire. But it says, you know what? The remnant of Philistia is going to perish. There's not going to be a Philistines anymore. The next is Tyre, which is in modern day Lebanon. Now, what they did is they were actually part of delivering this population to Edom. So they kind of ganged up with Gaza and with the Philistines, and they helped to capture this population, these communities, and actually sell them into slavery. Now, Joel also mentioned the time of the Philistines in Tyre delivering Judah to the Greeks. Now, the Greeks, it's a lot of debate whether the Greeks actually existed as just a sort of a proto-Grecian community, or whether they were big. They were obviously not the kingdom like we think of as the Greek or the Greco-Roman Empire. But there are some in academia who say, yes, there were Greeks, there were Greek people around this time, but just not what we think of as the great Greco-Roman Empire. So, the Philistines and Tyre were also delivering, while they were delivering the northern kingdom into Edom, they were also selling these populations or these communities of Judah to the Greeks. Then it says they didn't remember the covenant of brotherhood. Now, what covenant of brotherhood could they have possibly forgotten? There's actually 2. I thought of one, but actually during our live class, someone mentioned another. Edom, of course, is from Esau. Jacob, of course, was named Israel. So maybe that was the covenant of brotherhood that was being broken, the covenant between Jacob and Esau. But I tend to think that it refers to kind of this friendship that they had in the days of King David and King Hiram, who was actually the king of Tyre. Or it could be Hiram and Solomon, because if you remember back in 1 Kings chapter 5, Hiram sent Solomon all the material he needed and workers to finish the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem. Then we get to modern day Jordan. And 3 nations, one in the southern, one in the middle, and one in the northern part of modern Jordan. And the first is in southern part of modern Jordan, and that is the nation of Edom. Now, we talked about them a lot already when we studied Obadiah, so we're really not going to dwell on a lot of their history here with Israel. But their specific transgression in chapter 1, verse 11, was that he pursued his brother with a sword. And he stifled his compassion, and his anger and his fury is always going to be toward Israel forever. Now, if you remember, Esau actually threatened to kill Jacob. He said, as soon as my father dies, and boy, he's about to die, I'm going after my brother Jacob and I'm going to kill him. And then if you remember a little further along in the book of Exodus, Edom refused to allow Israel to pass through their land when they came out of Egypt. And Israel said, you know what, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to take your water. We're not going to take your food. We're going to go by the king's highway. I mean, there's nothing really there. We're not here to conquer you. We're not here to mess with you. If we need anything, we will gladly pay you for it. We just need to pass through here. And the Edomites of the time said, absolutely not. And to make sure that they didn't go that they had to go the long way around, they actually sent out an army after the Israelites to make sure they weren't able to get through. And so Israel had to turn around and go the long way around. If you also remember, Judah actually ruled over Edom for a time. And then Edom revolted in the days of Jehoram of the southern kingdom. They actually revolted against Judah and set up a king for themselves. And again, Edom's citadels, their strongholds, their mighty tower is actually going to be consumed by fire. Then in the northern part of modern Jordan sits Ammon, which actually still exists today in Amman, Jordan. Now, Ammon is named after Abraham's great-nephew, Ben-Ami. And if you remember, Abraham's nephew Lot had two sons pretty well close together, one by his oldest daughter, one by his youngest daughter. Now, the people of Ammon, or the Ammonites, actually came from Ben-Ami, who was the son of Lot's oldest daughter. Now, God gave Ben-Ami or Ammon very specific land as an inheritance. And when Israel went into their land, into Canaan, into the promised land, God told Israel, you don't take it. You leave that land alone. That's not for you to take. And they didn't do it. Ammon was very much idol worship. They worshiped a god named Molech. They were very proficient or prolific in child sacrifices, sacrificing children by fire. It also says that they went up against Gilead and they were ripping open pregnant women in order to enlarge their borders. Now, you know, I assume that what that means, and I take it very literal, given their propensity to child sacrifices, that as they're invading these lands, the northern, the southern kingdom, Israel and Judah, they would actually capture pregnant women. They would take their babies out and they'd sacrifice it to Molech as an offering, maybe so that they would have success, or maybe as an offering to thank him for their success. And God says, because of this, your judgment is going to be fire. You're going to be in these excruciating battles, and eventually you're just going to be exiled out. Now, Moab is in the middle part of Jordan, and Moab is Ben-Ami's half-brother, same dad, Lot, but a different mom by his youngest daughter. So they were brothers, half-brothers. And God gave very, very specific land to Moab. And at one point during their desert wanderings, while the children of Israel were wandering around the desert, Moab actually enticed Israel to come on in to a big festival they were throwing for their God. And Israel actually went. I mean, you know, who wouldn't? Now we got a lot of food going on. It's going to be fun. It's a big party. So they went in. But by them going in, they were turning to the gods of the nations. And God ended up killing a lot of them as discipline for their disobedience and for going after the gods of the Moabites. Now, in the days of Jehoshaphat, Edom, Moab, and Ammon actually got together. They all got together, formed this alliance, and they came up against Judah. And Jehoshaphat actually confessed in his prayer to God. He said, you know what, God, we don't know what to do, because we know there is absolutely no way we will ever beat this army. This army is huge. We are not. They are strong. We are not. They have these weapons. We do not. We don't know what to do. God, we're at a loss. But the one thing that we will do is we will continue to seek your face. They had worship services. They had down on their face, praising, worshiping God before God ever even told them what he was going to do for them. And then they had another service, a big worship service, praising God before he ever lifted a finger to help them. And if you remember, he told them, you go and you sit. You bring everybody, women, children, men, everybody. But nobody brings any weapons. Nobody. You sit on this mountain and you watch what I do. And what he did was two armies began to fight each other. Instead of fighting together, they fought each other. And then the loser fought the third army, and they all destroyed each other. And all Judah had to do was sit on the mountain and watch. But Moab developed this great arrogance against Israel because they were a very mighty and formidable nation. And so Moab, interestingly enough, is judged for burning the bones of the king of Edom. And that's really odd because that has nothing to do with their relationship to Israel. Nothing. It has to do with their relationship to another one of Israel's enemies. So why would God judge them for that? Well, someone suggested that it was because the king of Edom was dead. He was dead and buried, but as revenge, they dug up the bones and they burned them to ashes and they scattered them around so he could not have a proper burial. And that could be true. Maybe this was all about vengeance or revenge. We don't know. But their judgment was the exact same as Ammon. They were going to go to battle and they were going to suffer through this fire of God's judgment. And then, much to Israel's, I'm sure, delight, God turns his sights and Amos begins to prophesy against Judah, the southern kingdom. And their transgression was that they rejected God's laws and they were led astray by lies. Now, lies, the kasav, literally just deceptive things, what we would think of as a lie. But figuratively, it also includes false gods and idols. So they were led away by these deceptive things, by these false gods, by these idols. Romans 1:32 says, and although they know the ordinances of God, believers, people who know the ordinances of God, and that things that go against the ordinances of God are worthy of death, they not only do them, but they also approve of those who practice them. And that's exactly what was going on in the kingdom of Judah, even though they had a righteous king. They walked just as their fathers had walked. Now, typically, that's not Southern Kingdom language. That's Northern Kingdom language. We read over and over again about the Northern Kingdom, that they walked in the sin of Jeroboam in which he made Israel sin. But now it's being said of the Southern Kingdom during a time where their king was actually following God. They had a righteous king, but the people weren't righteous. So how are their transgressions any different than the other nations? Their transgression wasn't against any other nation. It was against God directly. But even though their transgression, even though their rebellion was different, their judgment was the exact same as all the other nations, and that was a consuming fire. Total annihilation. Now, I want you to think about something. Imagine you're Israel and you're living really large. I mean, you're doing your thing. You are building houses. You're oppressing the poor. You're worshiping idols. You're ignoring God's laws. And then up from the southern kingdom comes this prophet. And when he starts speaking about God coming and roaring from Zion and his voice uttering and that there's going to be a drought, I mean, that got your attention. That really got your attention. Now your ears are perking up because you're like, oh my gosh, what's about to happen to us? Our lifestyle's about to go down the drain. But the first thing that this prophet does is tell you that not that condemnation is coming for your sin and adultery. He doesn't say that. So, does then he give some kind of pronouncement of judgment against you? No. Does he announce some impending plague or doom or war? No. Does he at the very least tell you to stop doing what you're doing? Does he at least tell you need to go back to God? He doesn't. Instead, the prophet starts to pronounce judgments against your enemy and says absolutely nothing to you. So I can see as all these pronouncements are coming that Israel is taking these progressively deeper sighs of relief. Oh, okay, that one wasn't us. Oh boy, that one wasn't us. And it keeps going. So what do you think would be your thoughts? What would be your feelings about your action and your lifestyle? You got to be thinking, wow, God must not really care what we do. Or maybe even he approves of what we do. Because he isn't telling us to stop. He isn't telling us he's going to punish us for anything. So then your arrogance and your pride continues to increase. Your heart becomes harder and harder against God as you hear one by one these judgments against your 7 biggest adversaries, including the southern kingdom. Does this sound familiar at all? I think it sounds just like the United States. We're living this godless lifestyle, but yet we somehow continue to prosper, and we tend to think that God must approve, that God must be okay with it because we keep getting blessing, or worse, we have people that say, well, God must not exist because if he did, we'd be under some kind of punishment, and we're not, and nobody's telling us to stop, not even in our congregations, and our arrogance and our pride increases, our heart becomes hard against God. We see these judgments on these other nations, and we start to get more and more arrogant because we say, God will never judge us, and I don't know where we get that from. Because guess what? Israel got it. Because then in chapter 2, verse 6, God brings it back home. And he says, now, Israel, I'm coming for you. And he lists their transgressions. He said, you're oppressing the poor. You're doing acts of absolute profanity. You're breaking your vows. You're breaking your covenant with God. You're stealing things from people, and then you have the audacity to wear them in the temple, to wear them to the altar. You probably wore those same garments out there while you were worshiping in the high places. And now you're coming in with unholy garments that you probably stole from somebody that you used to worship idols, and you dare to come in here in my house and worship in my temple at my altar. They said, then the stuff that you stole, the wine that you took from people who were just trying to be out there to make a living, not only did you steal it, you took it home and you flaunted the fact that you enjoyed it. You were sinning and you didn't even blush at your own sin. And then God gives them a little history lesson. Starting in verse 9, he says, look what I've done for you. I destroyed your enemies, your great enemies, even the Amorites. I destroyed them and I gave you this land. I brought you out of Egypt. I led you through the wilderness for 40 years where your shoes and your clothes didn't even wear out. I even made sure when I said that I needed sacrifices of lambs and I needed sacrifices of drink offerings, I made sure that in the desert, as you're wandering around, you had enough grapes, you had enough crops that you were actually able to make that wine and give me that drink offering. I gave you prophets. I gave you Nazarites. And then look what you did to me. You've corrupted the land. You forsook me. You turned all these idols of the nations. You made the Nazarites drink wine. You made them break their vows. And then you even got to look at the prophets and tell them not to prophesy. Why? Because you don't want to hear what they're telling you. Because then you're going to know that you're doing wrong, and I'm going to expect some course correction. So you just tell them to sit down and shut up. And as a result, God became weighted down for their sin. Literally, it says he toddled under it. And so their judgment was coming. He said, you know what? You're trusting so much in yourselves. You're trusting in your army. You're trusting in the runners who can run fast, who can spy, who can tell you what's going on. You trust in the stalwart. You trust in the bowman. You trust in the rider. Well, guess what? None of them, not one, is going to be able to save themselves, much less the entire kingdom of Israel. And this is just the beginning of the judgments. There are 7 more chapters of judgment that's coming for Israel that we're going to get into over the next 2 weeks. Now, everybody take a breath, because now I'm going to go off topic for just a little bit. There's a quote on page 14 of our student book, and I actually typed it at the bottom of your student sheet if you've printed that out, along with some fill in the blanks. Now, the quote reads, "With knowledge must come understanding, a fear of the Lord, and a determination to part from evil and live righteously. And that, my beloved, is wisdom." When I read that, it really hit me that in that statement is the entire crux and purpose of inductive Bible study. Because inductive Bible study is 3 steps. First is observation. What does this passage say? Well, that would be the knowledge, with knowledge. Then the second step is interpretation. Well, what does that passage mean? Well, that goes right along with understanding. The third is application. How does this apply to me? What does this have to do with me? And that goes right along with the quote, determination to part from evil and live righteously. And that determination to part with evil and to live righteously is our sanctification. Our justification occurred when Jesus died on the cross. He justified. He weighed us and he found us equal. Our justification. We are even. Our sanctification occurs on our daily walk. That's our halakha. Our purification is going to occur when we are taken from this world by God. Now, for some more application, I have a question. And we think this all the time. Why do you believe, or why do you think, why do you assume that God will allow somebody to prosper when they are godless, when they are atheist, when they are evil, when they are whatever you want to call them? While it always seems like the godly are constantly struggling with their marriage, struggling with their finances, their job, their personal lives, their family, and their health. When we see the godless prosper, we need to keep one thing in mind. We need to understand that those godless are going to be judged. I mean, really, they're already being judged by God. But God does discipline those that he loves. Unfortunately, part of our sanctification includes God's discipline. In Hebrews 12:11, we're reminded that all discipline for the moment isn't joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peace of righteousness. So thank you for joining me in our very first lesson of Amos, Prepare to Meet Your God. If you're studying with us and you actually don't have a book, you can prepare for lesson 2 by reading Amos chapters 3 through 6 and look for that repeated phrase. As always, I'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, or maybe even some suggestions for future studies. But let's have a discussion. Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section under this video, or if you accessed it via my Facebook page, be sure to leave them in the comment section there. So until next time, Shavua Tov Alechem. Have a great week, everyone. Shalom, shalom.